Hello and welcome to Sullivan County 4-H Learn by Doing Beginner Watercolor Series. It's Caitlin, and today we're going to be going over some of the equipment that you're going to need to start off this series with so that you have everything you need before we get started with learning different techniques in watercolor painting. So the biggest one to talk about, of course, is the paper. Now there's lots of different types of watercolor paper out there. You can get it in sheets, you can get it in pads. It comes in different weights, so the texture of the paper is different. Some is heavier, some is lighter, some is more coarse in texture, some is very smooth in texture. There's cold pressed and hot pressed or warm pressed paper, and that kind of means how the paper is made. A cold press tends to be just a little more coarse, have a little more texture on it, versus a warm or a hot pressed paper. And all of that is information that is usually on either the sheet envelope, if you buy them in sheets, individual sheets, or on the outside of the packet, the watercolor packet. And I personally, and this is only my preference, I like a coarser kind of texture to my paper simply because I can utilize different techniques and they act a little differently on a really textured paper as opposed to a very smooth paper. But if you're going for a very loose kind of look to your paintings, you would need more of that smooth paper. So sometimes it depends on what you're painting, and sometimes it depends on your personal style and how you like to do your paintings. So just an example, I like to buy mine in sheets as well because I like to be able to feel the paper before I buy it, since I am particular about my texture. So this is a full sheet of watercolor paper, and this is a 260 weight. It's still pretty bendable, but it has a really nice texture to it. It's a little more rough, and just to show you a difference, so that's 260 cold pressed. This is a 400 cold pressed full sheet, and you can see this one is really stiff. It doesn't, I mean, it kind of bends, but it kind of sounds like cardboard. So this one is super, super stiff, and I save this heavy of a paper for special projects only. I don't typically paint with 400, but every once in a while you just need something that has a little bit more strength to it, so I go with that. But on a normal painting, I usually go with a 260 cold press. But again, play around with paper and see which one that you like better. And also, a 260 in a full sheet can be different than a 260 cold press in a package. Sometimes it's a little smoother, sometimes it's a little coarser. It also depends on the batch of paper. So you can definitely play around with your paper weight and find out the style that you like, the kind that you like. Just know that when we go over certain techniques, that's the weighted paper that I'm using. So if the technique looks a little different on your painting, it could be the paper. So just keep that in mind as we go over class. This, I'm also going to be using an established watercolor palette that's dry. So dry watercolor is pretty much, it comes in a tube, watercolor comes in a tube, and you establish it in a palette normally, just so that it's kind of ready when you're ready to paint. But I do know artists that use wet watercolor. You just have to be careful to use a lot less because the pigment is so saturated. So less paint goes further wet and not hard than dry. But you absolutely can use either or. And I will mention the colors that I'm using when I go over painting, just in case you want to know. But really, you do not need to use the same colors that I use. You do not need to use the same paints that I use or the same paper. It's really up to your interpretation, and this class is more of a guideline to show you different techniques that are out there. But my hopes is that you take these techniques that I show you and you really make them your own, and you do it in your own style, in your own colors, in your own way. So I will go over the names of the colors that I use, but keep in mind you do not have to use these colors, and I hope that you really do make this painting your own. So keep that in mind. And of course, very important, go over brushes. So I'm going to show you the basic shapes that I like to use and that I find myself often using. And I have multiple of these shaped brushes just in different sizes. So more likely than not, we'll be using one of these 4 shapes that I'm going to show you, but the size just might differ a little bit depending on what we're working on and the size paper we're working on. So the first one is kind of this rounded brush, and in general, watercolor brushes, you do want them to be a little softer, because when you wet the paper, it can, if you have too hard of a brush, it can kind of pill the paper when you're working with it if your brush is too stiff. So some brushes out there might just be a little too coarse, so you do want one that's pretty soft, like you can see here. So this round brush I use a lot, and I have a couple different sizes of it. This one is a 1-inch oval brush. So that's the first one. Then this square brush, flat brush, I use a ton for a lot of different techniques. This one also is a 1-inch, but I have this in multiple sizes, like I said before. And what I like to do, it's usually found on the back of a square brush, but if you can find one that has this edged angle on the back, I will be showing you some techniques to use with this back kind of slanted brush as opposed to your typical rounded handle. So if you can find one that has that, I'm going to be showing you some techniques with that. You can use other items in replacement of that if none of your brushes have that. You can definitely, I'll show you some alternative methods that you can use. And then the third one rather, is kind of this longer skinny brush, and this one is pretty much specifically used for long blades of grass and tree branches, for like deciduous trees, leafy trees. That's pretty much what this guy is used for, grass and tree branches. But the whole point of this guy is that when you wet it, it's very thin, so you can pick it up and get nice thin tips on things. So I call this a rigger brush. I think it's also referred to as a liner, and that's this guy. This is pretty much the size I have in this one, but of course you can get them bigger and smaller. You can have multiple sizes if you want to. This is a level 6 for this guy. And then the last one is just this kind of basic, very small tipped, hopefully you can see that, tipped brush. And I use this for more detail work. So if I'm painting in a small area, and I have this style brush in multiple sizes, but if I'm painting in a small area, or I'm trying to paint details in moving water, like a splashback, stuff like that, small rocks, that's what I use these guys for. So, and this one does also come with a beveled edge as well. So you can find them on more than just the square brush. But yeah, so that's that little guy. And I have this in a lot of different sizes. And then the last one isn't technically necessary, but I like to have it, and that's this big behemoth. And this is just a regular 2.5-inch wooden handled brush. And what I solely use this for, this has never seen paint. This does not get any paint on it. This is the brush I use to wet my paper with, because sometimes it is hard to get all of the color out of your brushes when you're painting, especially when you're using them right after another, trying to change out colors. But I like to make sure that the brush I start with, if I need to wet my background on my paper to start, I know that this isn't holding any pigments, so it keeps the color of my paper true. So if I want to go back in later and put some clouds in, and I want to use the paper color instead of white paint, I know that this brush will not stain my paper right out of the gate. So I just like to keep a separate kind of big brush solely for wetting my paper. But that's kind of up to you if you want to do that. And then just some other things to have. Of course, you want some kind of container of water. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Just make sure that, of course, the water isn't tainted with any kind of color, like if it's a little brown or a little yellow, either from some residue in your container. Just make sure that it's nice, clean water, and we'll be changing our water probably multiple times when we paint, just to make sure that when we clean our brush, we actually clean it and we don't pick up the color that's in the water. And also a pencil. We will be very, very basically sketching out our paintings, but in watercolor, you don't typically put a ton of detail in your initial sketch of your painting, you give yourself more of an idea of what you're doing, because the detail is really in when you paint. So it kind of saves a little time, but you will need a pencil to start your very basic sketch with at first. And I like to have a roll of paper towels with me. Whenever I dry my brushes, I like to just kind of squeeze them out with a paper towel, and then I can see if there's any color left on it that I might need to wash it again. And also for certain techniques, you'll need a paper towel on hand too to help with it. And that is pretty much the equipment that you will need to start this watercolor adventure with me. So some paper of your preference, whatever you would like, your brushes, your paints, whether they're wet or dried paints, and you can use whatever colors you already have on hand. But I will tell you the colors I'm using in case you need to know or you want to know. And your container of water, your pencil, and paper towels. And of course, a pen at the end, a nice pen at the end so that you can sign your name when you're all done with your painting. So that is all you need to start out with. And I'm looking forward to showing you the first set of techniques that we'll be doing in the next session. Thank you so much for watching. This is Caitlin with Sullivan County 4-H Learn by Doing. And for more videos or project ideas, be sure to check out Cornell Cooperative Extension, Sullivan County, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. For more information about Sullivan County 4-H, be sure to check out the link below. And just a PSA, remember that, of course, the Sullivan County Youth Fair is coming up in August, and you absolutely can submit your watercolor paintings to the fair as a still exhibit. Just keep in mind that those entries are due August 1st. So I will keep reminding you about that throughout this series. And at the end, I'll show you how you can prepare your painting for fair if you wish to bring it to fair. So hopefully I'll see some of those at the fair this year, and we'll see you next time. Happy painting.